Hi, gorgeous. All right, one treat for each of you. Yeah, is that good? Good boys. Good boys.
Fellow homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. I am playing around today with sorghum. Sorghum is a grass, just like corn is a grass, just like sugarcane is a grass, and it's commonly used in the South to make a syrup. It also creates a head that can be used for grain or it's often fed to livestock. But in the South, there's particular varieties of sorghum that are sweet and have been bred to be sweet. And they typically juice it the same way you would juice sugar cane. So they put it through a press, and then that syrup from the press is then cooked down and turned into sorghum syrup. And I've had sorghum syrup before. I bought some when I was traveling in Arkansas years ago, and I like it. And sorghum's kind of a long season plant, but we have a fairly long season. And it occurred to me that it would be really nice to have an additional source of sweetener on the farm besides honey. I am a terrible beekeeper. I've tried to keep bees various times in my life, and yeah, I'm a terrible beekeeper. And so while I can get honey locally, I'm not good at raising it myself, and there just aren't a lot of natural sweeteners that you can grow on the farm. And so I thought it would be fun to grow some sorghum. I tried growing it last year, and I did manage to harvest it and make some syrup, but I harvested it after we had a frost, and it turns out that that's a bad thing with sorghum. There's something about a chemical change that happens in it after a frost, and I believe the substance that it creates is cyanide. I'll have to look it up and I'll confirm that on the screen. But definitely not something you want to eat. And so there's all kinds of warnings all over the internet about not feeding sorghum to livestock after it's been frosted, and to not make syrup out of it if it's been frosted. And I couldn't find anything that just said why. It just said don't do it, and that's always wildly frustrating to me. And so I ended up I did some research, found a professor who specialized in sorghum, and sent him an email and just said, hey, everything I'm reading on the internet says don't do stuff with this after a frost, but nothing is really specific. Can you please explain what the deal is? And he said, yeah, you don't want to eat that. It's got some cyanide in it. So good to know. It can be tricky to get it to full maturity here in Southeast Washington. Our season is not obviously as long as it would be if we were in the South, but it's doable. You just have to really be careful to make sure that you harvest it before you get a frost. It is now the 24th, I believe, of September. And so we probably have another couple of weeks until we get a frost. Sometimes we go all the way into November. That's pretty rare. But we often make it to mid-October. I have quite a bit more out there, and so I'll harvest the rest of it a little bit later. This was harvested because the bed that I put it in also has some other things in it, and it got really, really tall and then blew over in the wind, and I've tied it up multiple times, and it was overshadowing one of my squash. I have a patty pan squash out there that is just it was basically getting no sun anymore because it was getting buried by the sorghum. And so I harvested this part of the sorghum in order to uncover my patty pan to try to get a few more harvests out of that. So the question becomes, what do you do if you want to grow sorghum but you don't have a press? Because those are basically two big steel rollers, and sometimes they're hand cranked, and sometimes usually they're run by a motor, and it squeezes the juice out of them just like with sugarcane. But I'm not going to spend the money on a sorghum press. And so I was like, there's got to be a way to make syrup out of this without having to have a press. And internet to the rescue, found a video last year that detailed how to do exactly that. And so that's what I'm doing here. So basically, if they're really skinny, I'm just throwing them in the pot. If they're kind of fat, then I'm splitting them in half. And basically what I'm trying to do is just increase the surface area so that when water is in the pot that I'm throwing these into, it will have lots of surface area in which to dissolve whatever sugar is in these stems. It was interesting when I was cutting this out by my washing sink that there were actually bees and wasps that started to come in. And so even though I can't really smell the sugar on this, they could totally tell that there was something sweet going on because all of a sudden I had wasps in the sink. So that's kind of interesting. The one that I did make last year, it did work. I did end up with a very nice looking syrup, but then of course it wasn't edible. So I went to all that work. And then in the end, I just threw it out because I didn't want to poison anybody. But yeah, so this is a method. It's time consuming. This is definitely, if you were going to do this on a large scale, you would definitely want to invest in a press. But for just piddling around and trying out some stuff, this is totally a method that works. So yeah, I'm splitting everything in half. And you notice when I was cutting it earlier to get the leaves off, it grows very much like bamboo. It's got a node. Let's see if I can find one. There's one that you can see there. So this node, and then the leaf comes up from here. If you cut it right above where that node is, this is a good example, that leaf isn't attached anymore because it's attached where that node is, and so you can just peel that leaf off. And depending on how dry it is, sometimes that leaf is really easy to take off, and sometimes it's a little bit tricky because it's kind of stuck to the stem. I'll put some links below to some of the research that I did on how do you know when to harvest sorghum, how do you know when it's ripe, other things that you can do with it. I've never played around with the actual top. I know that it's edible. I need to do that as well and play around with actually eating it and seeing how it is. I usually just save some of that for seed and then feed the rest of it to my chickens. It is a very nice forage for your farm animals, which is another good thing to have on a homestead as we start thinking more and more about sustainability long-term, after coming through COVID and then inflation. Like, how do you actually depend less on off-farm inputs? And this might be one of those ways. So it's, again, nobody thinks about it outside of the South, but there's no reason that if you have a fairly long growing season that you couldn't do this where you are. Assuming you have some heat in the summer. It does like heat, and so you do need to have some heat in the summer. And if anything, our trend here locally is more and more heat. The last 2 summers we've had have been quite warm, much warmer than normal, and so yeah, it loves the heat. You can see this is a really big pot. And the more water you put in, the more water you're going to have to evaporate later. So you really just want this to be just enough to cover. Everything's going to want to float. Nothing you can really do about that. So we're going to turn this to high heat. I'm going to boil this. Once it comes to a boil, I'm going to time it and boil it for about an hour. So our water has come to a full boil here. And I'm just going to try to stir this about every 15 minutes to make sure that things are moving around in there and that stuff that's floating on the top gets moved. And you can smell the sugars in there already. So they're definitely releasing into that water for sure. I boiled this for probably a little over an hour. I was watching an online video who suggested if you, if you taste the end of these and they don't have any sweetness when you chew on them, that's a good indication that you've done what you can and that they're not going to get, you're not going to extract anything else. So that was an interesting, and I did try that just on a really small one and it didn't taste like much. So hopefully we've thoroughly extracted all of the goodness. This was a really bad choice of container. They are a little tricky to fish out of here. Tongs work, but you can't really turn it to the side or everything just slips out. So you gotta kind of just let everything drip. Case in point. And I'll run this through a sieve, but I think that's most of it. I'm gonna cook it down first before I do that. I can feed those to the cows. All right, so we're gonna turn the heat back on and I'm just gonna boil this down until I go to bed, and then I'll turn it on and boil it again in the morning. We'll see how far we get. So here we are, status next morning. I poured this into a smaller pot as it cooked down. And this is a 3-quart pot. We're probably down to about 2.5 quarts. It smells amazing in here. So we're getting there, slowly but surely. I did strain this through a strainer before I put it into this pot, and I will strain it one more time when it's finally finished. Yeah, we're getting there. So this is what's left. We are down to, guessing that's about 2 cups. Still cooking it, but I'm watching it really closely. See the size of those bubbles? That's an indication that there's still quite a bit of water in there. As those bubbles get much tinier and foamier, that is an indication that you are really close or at where you want to stop in terms of the syrup. So what I'm doing right now is I have a timer set for 5 minutes, and I'm just checking this every 4 or 5 minutes while I'm doing other things in the kitchen to make sure that I don't accidentally burn this, because it would be really easy to burn this. So that's where we're at right now, almost there. All right, it's been about 8 minutes from the last time we looked at this. See how small those bubbles are? That is an indication that the water has boiled off and we are down to syrup. Also, notice if I swirl it, how it foams up because the sides of the pan are hot. That is also an indication. Be careful when you do that because it can easily boil over. That's another indication that we are pretty much done. So I'm going to call that good. I'm going to filter this into a jar with a little bit of cheesecloth. There's a little bit of grit that comes along with this. There's a name for it. You see it in maple syrup as well. Something sand, and it's actually residual protein that's in the plant itself. And so ideally you want to filter that out. I think I'm going to put this in a measuring cup first. One, because I'm curious how much we got. And two, because it's going to be easier to filter into this than it is into my final jar. Yeah, you can see there's some viscosity there. This is still really, really hot, so it's going to be a little bit thicker when it cools. This is awkward because that filter will not stay up unless I brace it on something. Look at that. It has a distinctly molassesy type of flavor. You can see as that's cooling how that's just sticking. So we were right about where we wanted to be. I'm kind of wondering if I shouldn't have done a single layer of cheesecloth there. It's literally as slow as molasses. I'm gonna do this and see if it helps. My Achilles heel with this kind of stuff is patience. I am terrible at just letting something sit. My concern, of course, is that this is going to just clog up to the point where nothing moves. And then I've got to figure out how to get sorghum syrup out of cheesecloth. So while to some extent I'm probably pushing some of the stuff that I'm trying to filter out through, it's better than it getting stuck in here and not moving at all. And if I had started with more sorghum, or if I had boiled that for longer, I might have been able to extract more of the actual sugars in the plant. This was a really quick and dirty. I had cut those just to trim them off of my my plants and didn't want it to go to waste. So this is going to be a tiny harvest, and I knew that going in, but I wanted to show you guys the process. All right, I got the worst of it through. I will ignore that for a while, go back to making salsa, which is what I'm also doing this lovely Saturday. And I'll just let that continue to drip and see where we end up. All right, you guys, there you have it. All of that boiling for about 1/3 of a cup of syrup. So yeah, crazy. It's actually, believe it or not, I think more efficient than making maple syrup, which I've also done. You can make tree syrups out of lots of things, not just sugar maples. And so I've done it from a couple of different kinds of trees, and that will be a future video, hopefully. This definitely has a molasses-like flavor. There's a little bit of bitterness to it. It's very strong. And so, you know, depending on your personal taste, it may be something that you enjoy over something as simple as pancakes. Or it might be something you use in granola or maybe molasses type cookies. But there you go, sorghum syrup, another homestead sweetener. Very fun. Thanks for watching, tribe. We'll see you next week.